Okay, so welcome back, everybody. Coming up in the middle of the week, starting on Wednesday, we'll be starting Sefer Yirmiyahu. And unlike the other books we've had so far, which are sort of in historical order, in chronological order, even Yeshayahu jumping around a lot, it's still in the beginning of the book, we have who the kings were, but it's pretty easy to follow the order of events in at least in the first 12 chapters. And then we go to nations. When you get to Yirmiyahu, it's much harder to follow the chronology. And as a way of introduction, I'd say it like this. When you study Sefer Yirmiyahu the first time and you're not aware of the historical setting, it just sounds like the same old prophetic things that everyone's been saying up until now. Saying, do tshuva. If you're bad, God's going to punish you. Do good. You'll get rewarded. Don't serve other gods, otherwise you'll be punished. God's angry when you serve other gods. Return to God. He'll be with you. He can redeem you, and you'll be a good person, and be kind to the poor and the needy. But it's so repetitive. What's unique about Yirmiyahu? So, what I want to explain today is that if you don't know the historical time setting with Yirmiyahu, you'll be lost. So, usually I give a share after you've read the prakim and try to tie things together. I decided for Yirmiyahu, I want to go forward to help you plow through the first couple chapters. Now, what I want to begin with, I want to tie this to what we saw in your about Yeshayahu as well. There was in the Hebrew options, there was a shir by Yossi Elitzur about where to put what they call Deutero-Isaiah. So the famous classical approach, but that Isaiah is talking about in his time period, what's going to happen 200 years later, and he's a Navi can do that. That's so-called, I call that the firm approach. Then there's the approach I try to support. Rabbi also has, and Ibn Ezra, and most of academia, that they're prophets from an early Second Temple period. The Chiddush I tried to show you last week is that it's not just later Second Temple period, it's the very beginning of Temple period in Babel itself, telling the people that Koresh is the hand of God, even though Koresh doesn't realize that. But I need a Navi to tell you that Yirmiyahu's 7 years are over and it's time to come back. And I don't have a Navi saying that, and I have a Navi saying that without a name. I need a Navi to tell the people that, which explains the beginning of Vayet Again, we'll talk about that maybe next week when we get to Yirmiyahu, the second part of Yirmiyahu. But what I want to talk about today is in Yossi Elitzur shir, he followed pretty much the same approach that Rav Meidan and Rav Yoel Ben Nun, primarily Rav Yoel Ben Nun did. And actually, I used to teach it that way up until about 10 years, 15 years ago, because he mentions that Koresh's great-grandfather was also called Koresh, who was living in time of Menachem. And that's how I used to teach it as well. And there's a lot to it. It's credible, and it could be. I just think it's more compelling the later approach, but either is fine. But I want to take something that very much relates to his approach, but also relates to the background for Yirmiyahu. I'll just make my main point in the beginning, and then we'll get to work. What I want to claim is as follows. In Yirmiyahu's time period, which we'll talk about in a minute, the overall feeling is we're in the Second Temple period. In other words, everyone knows the arch enemy of the Jewish people, the first temple period, was Ashur. The worst of the bunch was Sancheriv. Sancheriv wiped out the northern tribes, started with Sargon, first Tiglath-Pileser, then Sargon, and then Sancheriv just wiped everything out. The northern tribes were wiped out during Hiskiyahu's reign. Most of the cities of Judea, especially Lachish, which is like historically like proven without beyond a shadow of a doubt. And Yerushalayim was almost taken, but was saved at the last minute. So what Yossi Elitzur's whole point was in his shir, which is the way Rabbi Yoel Ben Nun follows as well, is that the destruction is so great in the time of Menachem that the so-called Deutero-Isaiah is not talking about returning from Babylonian exile; it's returning from Assyrian exile. Um, and then for some reason they call Ashur Bavel. That's the hurdle he has to cover. Because everything I showed you last week was based on the idea that Deutero-Isaiah is talking about getting out of Bavel. So you have to say that when he says Bavel, it really means Ashur. Anyway, I don't want to go into that much in detail. But what I explain is to understand Yirmiyahu, in the eyes of the people, we reach rock bottom in the time of Menachem. We're going to see the Gzardin of Churban is in the time of Menachem. We'll see why, and we'll see how that's going to explain our Sefer Yirmiyahu, what's happening. So let me go back for a minute and ask you guys a question. Ask anybody who's been through the yeshiva system, why was the first temple destroyed in contrast to the second temple? But go to start with the beginning. What was the reason for the second temple being destroyed? Okay, and the first temple?
Avodah Zarah.
Not just Avodah Zarah. Remember the big
Murder,
three?
murder also.
Yeah, murder. But the big three: Avodah Zarah, Gilui Arayos, and Shvichus Damim. Remember the big three: murder, idolatry, and license and Arayos, whatever it's called in English. Those are the so-called big three, the three Yarog Yavors. Now, that's the Gemara in Yoma talks about it. I think Daf Tedam is better yet Aleph. But either way, the whole discussion in the Gemara is about how bad Sinat Chinam is, how bad baseless hatred is, and the whole point Yirmiyahu is making, the Gemara is making, is telling you how bad Sinat Chinam is, because the first temple that had the big three, came back after 70 years, but the second temple, which only had Sinat Chinam, it's been hundreds of years and we're not back yet in the time of the Gemara. Now, the topic isn't what was the reason for the first temple being destroyed. The overall topic there is how bad Sinat Chinam is, which is an important topic. Now, when you study that Gemara that talks about the big three, all the psukim, all the verses they're bringing are from the time period from the Navi Yeshayahu and from the time period of Menachem. And that's what I want to show you, because I want to make my opening point, is that I could view the time period of Menachem as Churban Bayit Rishon. And there I'll agree with Yossi, what Yossi presented in his Hebrew shir, and the direction Yoel Ben Nun goes with, that I could see Sancheriv and the time period of Menachem as Churban Bayit Rishon and the Gzardin. I'm going to use that to explain what's happening in Yirmiyahu. First, let's see what they're talking about. I'm going to share my screen, and we're going to read first from where are we? We don't want my mail. We want a chumash. Okay, we're going to open up Sefer Melachim. Where are we? Let's get that back to the top and make this smaller. That's better. Okay, Sefer Melachim. Melachim chapter. What chapter is that going to be? Chapter 21. Melachim Bet. So pay attention. Menashe is only 12 when he becomes king. Remember, his father Chizkiyahu waited many years till he had children, and finally only has children later in his life, and therefore when he dies, his son is only 12 when he becomes king, which means he's probably not running the kingdom until many years later. Okay. And he's king for 55 years, which is a really long time. But during his time period is when Ashur finally falls. Ashur is still a superpower when he takes over, but they're going to fall and they're going to crumble during his time period. By the time it's over, the Babylonians are already inching into the Middle East is open for grabs. Now listen to how the Navi describes how bad things are in his time period. Number one, V'yasarei b'nei Hashem ketovot hagoyim asher horish Hashem b'pnei B'Yisrael. These are the toivot. This is word for word Vayikra chapter 18, which is the arayot. Now the toivot that the other nations did, and the reason why God kicked them out is exactly in chapter 18 of Vayikra, the arayot. So we have arayot. Now of idol worship. We go from bad to worse. Vayashav yivin et habamot. Remember, Chizkiyahu got rid of the bamot. He brings the bamot back, but that's serving God in the high places, which is not so bad. Then he gets the next step, like Achab did. He brought misbachot to Baal and Asherah. That's worse. That's Avodah Zarah, just like Achab did, okay? And he bowed down to them, all the hosts of the heavens. And not only did he do idol worship outside in the hills of Jerusalem or in the hills of the country, he brought idol worship into the temple itself. Ubanam misbachot b'Beit Hashem. He built altars to those gods in God's own house, in anger with God, the house associated with God's name. He built altars there to every avodah zarah possible of the heaven in the two courtyards of the temple. Then basically the Navi is going to show the book at him. Everything in Sefer Devarim they talk about you can't do, he did. He passed his son through fire. He did Ovid Nidoni. Everything, you look in chapter 18 in Vayikra, everything possible. Chapter 18 in Devarim, he did all those. And he did it lahachis. In other words, he was angry with God, and you know, here's why he's angry with God. His father, Chizkiel, was the firmest king ever, and all these terrible things happened during his father's reign. He's angry with God. He's had it with God, and basically um, brings all this idol worship in his anger. Then he puts a pesach, a idol to Asherah in God's house itself, a house which is dedicated for God's name and reputation. He put there, and God promised, "I won't make you leave the country, only on the condition though, if you keep my laws." And now they didn't listen. And here's a big line: Menachem led them. They're acting like the nations that got throughout, and therefore, if the only reason we kicked them out was to do something better, we're not doing anything better. Therefore, he has to kick us out. And therefore, God told his Nevi'im, Yan Asher Nevi'im. Now, we don't say who these Nevi'im are. So what they claim that might be what we call Deutero Isaiah. That's in Yosef Litzur. No, but Yan Asher Sam Menachem Hatuavot Ela, because Menachem did all these terrible things. He's worse than all the people who were there before him, worse than the Amorites, and he caused you to sin to those idols in that way. Now here comes the Gzardin of Churban. 1 second, let me close the door. Okay. Lachen, here's the tradition. Here's what's called the Gzardin. Lachen. Kol ma Hashem el Yisrael, here's the word of God. Something terrible is going to happen to Jerusalem. Anyone hearing the news, his ears are going to ring or tingle. Who knows where we have the exact same nevuah? That the news will come and the ears are going to tingle. Almost the same wording. Anyone remember? It was back in Shmuel Aleph, the destruction of Shiloh. The opening nevuah that Shmuel gets about Beit Eli, he says something's going to happen to the house of God in Shiloh because of the corruption there. Anyone who hears the news of the destruction of Shiloh, his ears are going to tingle. The exact same wording in Perek Gimel and Shmuel in Shmuel Aleph. Now, listen carefully now. This is a nevuah of Churban. This is a prophecy of destruction. V'natiti al Yerushalayim et kap Shomron. Yerushalayim had the same fate as Shomron, which was destroyed already by the Ashur. But Mishkol et Beit Achav. Uv'mechiti et Yerushalayim sheimchet hatzalachet macha v'afacha paneh. I'm going to wipe Jerusalem off the map. V'nasati et sharet nachlati v'natin bi'arevim v'yu lavaz mishah b'choyevim. I'm going to wipe out the rest of my nachala, the nation. Basically, this is because Menachem is so bad, God's going to bring what we call Churban, destruction. Why? They've been angry, bad to me since the time they left Egypt. It's not just a one-time sin; it's going over and over again. And finally, began dam nakishavach menasher be'meod asher midei Yerushalayim peh lepeh leban michta sheichtet Yehuda. Here we have shfichut damim. So that's the big three: shfichut damim, avodah zarah, and arayot. We have all three, and these are the psukim the Chazal quote for Beit Rishon. The Gzar Din, the decree of Churban Beit Rishon is in time of Menachem. Then Menachem, we end the loss of the story of Menachem here. His son Amon takes over. He's king for 2 years. He gets assassinated by some right-wingers because he goes back to his father's ways. We'll see in a minute. Menachem did tshuva in the meantime. And then the people kill the supporters of his government, killed the assassins. The Abdei Amon, the servants of Amon, killed the assassins. And they made Yoshiyahu king, his son Yoshiyahu king. It said, but Yoshiyahu was only 8 years old when he became king. But Amon didn't get much done. He went back to Menachem's ways, and things are really bad. Now, we need this to understand the background to Yoshiyahu. One more line. I'm going to go to Divrei Yamim. But we don't hear here in Divrei Yamim, we talk about the later years of Menachem. First of all, he was taken into exile, but returned from exile. And he does tshuva at the end of his life, and he picks up Yerushalayim and fixes things up again. Amon goes back on his ways, and Yoshia is going to fix things up. Now, in light of this, let's read what happens. Actually, I'll just go right to Divrei Yamim. It's a lot easier to see it there, because we'll see much more details about Yoshiyahu there. Where are we? We need Chronicles. Here's in the beginning. And let's try 33. Yeah. So we have Menachem in chapter 33, just like here, but in the end of Menachem, When things got bad for him, here he comes. Menachem came in, captured him, Menachem, and put him in captivity and took him to Babel. But when things were bad for Menachem, he began to pray to God, and he gave in. He did tshuva. He prayed to God. God listened to his prayer and brought him back to Yerushalayim. And Menachem knew Ki Hashem hu Elohim. And then he rebuilt the walls of Jerusalem a little bit, fixed up the temple already, and fixed up the walled cities of Jerusalem. He got rid of the idol worship from the house of God. Basically, he fixes his ways. Okay. And then he fixed up the Mizbeach again. But again, there's still Bamot, but he got rid of the idol worship. But we said, Ammon will bring it back in. Again, it's interesting why Divrei Yamim has this tshuva, but Melachim doesn't have it. We'll try to understand why very soon when we get to Ammon and Yoshiel. Okay. We have finished up Menashe, then we took 2 years of Ammon, and he does evil in the eyes of God, just like Menashe did in his bad years, and he brought back all the idol worship back in. So we see things didn't really change too much. He didn't give in like Menashe did. Ammon was even worse. And therefore, some of his servants, some of his people in this government decided to do what's called Achlafat Mishtar. Nowadays they switched the government and they assassinated the king. But then the people who liked the king got rid of the assassins, and they made his son Yoshiel king, who was only 12 years old. Now, Yirmiyahu is going to begin his career during the reign of Yoshiel in year 13. We'll see in a minute. We'll read the first lines of Yirmiyahu in a minute. But we have to see the background when Yirmiyahu's career begins. Listen what happens in the reign of Yoshiel. What I want to claim is the worst is over during the time of Menachem. This coincides with the fall of the Assyrian Empire as the Babel is about to come into power, but there's a sort of a vacuum in the Middle East. And early in Yoshiel's reign, things are going to get better, and they're going to see this as the beginning of redemption, as we'll see in a minute. Chapter 34. Listen carefully. Yoshiel was 8 years old when he's king. He's king for 31 years. Okay? Look how good Yoshiel is. V'yas ha'asha b'nei Hashem, v'elech b'darchei David aviv, lo sar min small. He was king when he was 8. He does tshuva 8 years later when he's 16. 8 years into his reign. 16, he begins learning. He goes to Yeshivat Tichonit. He goes to Yeshiva High School and starts getting frum. Now, that means the first 8 years of his reign, and he's still young, that means Ammon's cabinet. Ammon was assassinated, but Ammon's men are running the country, which means we're still full of idol worship, and we still have the sins of Menashe in our background. And Menashe's tshuva didn't last very long. So in the 8th year of his reign, he starts learning, he starts turning to God. And the 12th year of his reign, he begins to clean up Jerusalem from all the idol worship. So what's called the Josiah reform, Yoshiel, in English called Josiah, his reform begins in year 12 of his kingdom, and that's going to coincide exactly with the beginning of Yirmiyahu's career. We'll see in a minute. In the first line of Yirmiyahu, Yirmiyahu begins his prophecies in year 13, which pretty much is the same as year 12, but within a year. It's during the beginning of Yoshiel's reform is when Yirmiyahu begins his career. We have to keep that in mind. So in the 12th year of his reign, he begins to clean up Yerushalayim from all the idol worship. And listen what he does. Basically, he wipes out all the idol worship, which means there was tons of idol worship still around from Ammon and Ammon's successors who were running the country until Yoshiel grew up and took over his reign and started doing things. And he cleaned up Yerushalayim. But listen carefully. Where else did he extend his reign? Uvarein Menashe ve'Ephraim v'Shimon vad Naphtali b'chorvotem saviv. He didn't only wipe out idol worship in the areas of Judea, also, and he fixed up all the destroyed cities of Judea. He also got to Ephraim and Menashe, and to Shimon, wherever that is, all the way to Naphtali. That's Tzfat, that's the Galilee. Even though they were wiped out by Ashur, we'll see later on, Yoshiel returns to the northern kingdom. And we'll see why very soon. He wipes out all the places of idol worship the Asharim and Psilim, etc., totally wiped out, like Sefer Devarim commands. And basically, he's on a tremendous reform to get Israel back to return to God. We'll see the political reason for this very soon. In the 18th year of his reign, he begins to renovate the temple. Okay, the temple was in shambles thanks to Menachem, what Menachem did to it. And he goes, is mechazek the Beit Hashem. And in the middle of renovating the temple, that's when they find the Sefer Torah. Again, it's got to be that they must have had copies of the Sefer Torah. I think they found the original from the time of Menachem. Okay, they're and then here, when they're collecting all the money for renovating and cleaning up the temple, okay, Chilkiel found Sefer Torah Hashem Biad Moshe. I don't think people knew the Torah, but they found the original, which was probably put into Geniza when when Menachem was ruining the temple. The Kohanim put it into Geniza, and they came and found it. Okay, so Chilkiel sees this, and Chilkiel, the Kohen Gadol, sends it to Shaphan the Sofer, who brings it to the king. He brings the king to read it, and then that leads to this great reform that Yoshiel does. He gathers the nation together, and what's Chilkiel ask? He says, he tells the king, and the king says, "L'chud Yeshuat Hashem ba'adi, uvad hanishar b'Yisrael v'Yehuda divrei sefer asher nimsa, ki gdola chamat Hashem asher nitcha banu, asher shomru avotenu et davar Hashem asur chatu b'sefer hazeh." Chazal said it was open to the Tochacha, somewhere in Sefer Devarim, but Yoshiel thinks this is terrible. I mean, this is a great opportunity. He says, it sounds really dangerous. We have to do something about it. They call Chuda Neviah. This is what Chuda tells him. Chuda tells him, Kol mar Hashem hinimi vi ra al makom hazeh al yoshva v'kol alot haktuva al sefer shekru b'lifnei Hashem Yehuda. Chuda is saying, sounds like the Gzar Din is still there. Because you left me, you follow all these other gods. But tell the king, Melech Yehuda, tell him, okay, go tell him, Kol mar Hashem, Yan Rach Levavcha, because you did tshuva, okay, and you humbled yourself in front of God. When you heard these words, yeah, again, and you ripped your clothing and said you did proper tshuva, it won't happen in your lifetime. You're going to die before it's ruined, before the temple's destroyed, okay? So you won't see this destruction in your time. It'll come in a later time period. He doesn't take that as a no, Yoshiel, but rather the king goes up and he prays, and he makes a new covenant between God and the people. So he does a big Passover, we'll see. He makes a brit between God to follow God's ways, etc., to do proper tshuva, and the whole nation of Israel gathers together in Yerushalayim, and they make a new brit with God. And Yoshe gets rid of all the toivot in the land, any type of idol worship they got rid of, and they returned to their God. And during all of his time, they didn't leave God, the God of their fathers. Now, keep this in mind. This is all we need to understand Yirmiyahu. In the next chapter, Yoshiel does this massive Passover. Has been one like this since the time of Shmuel, I think, or time of the Shoftim. What's it say here? Basically, it's the biggest Passover ever. Yeah. Since the time of Shmuel. Remember when Shmuel did people tshuva after the Korban of Shiloh? What Yoshel is trying to do is to undo the Gzar Din from the time of Menachem. And just like Shmuel makes a whole new covenant with the people after Shiloh is destroyed, and gets the people to do proper tshuva and does a big gathering. That's chapter 7 in Shmuel Aleph. In Mitzvah, Yoshel is trying to do the same thing. Now, all this happens in after this Pesach, in year 18. But despite all this, after all this, what happened? Paro Nechol, here's the historical information, which matches outside history, which is key to understanding what's happening in Yirmiyahu. Paro Nechol leaves Egypt on its way to fight Bavel and Karkemish, the Babylonian in Karkemish. It's called the famous Battle of Karkemish, where Nebuchadnezzar is going to defeat Paro Nechol by the Euphrates River. Yoshiel goes to meet Paro Nechol in Israel by Megiddo. And let's just explain briefly what happens. We'll see on the map. And basically, in that battle, Yoshiel goes and tries to stop the Egyptian army from marching through Israel on the way to Karkemish. And he dies in that battle by Megiddo, even though he was such a firm king. And then Yirmiyahu starts lamenting the death of Yoshiel. And some people say some of the kinot, I think, Echad Paragimel is usually attributed to this event. Okay. So now, then his son takes over. One son takes over and lasts for a couple months and gets killed. And then his other son, Yehoiakim, takes over. We'll get to them in a minute. Actually, maybe we should read it real quickly so you know the background. The people took Yoachaz to become king, instead of his father. He was 23 when he became king. He was king for 3 months. Then when Egypt came back after losing the battle of Carchemish, they depose Yoachaz, and he goes down to Egypt and gets killed. And he appoints Eliakim, his brother, and changed his name to Yehoiakim, and he becomes king for the next 11 years. So basically, Yehoiakim sort of sides with Egypt, and he gets the kingdom, and his brother gets deposed, and Yehoiakim basically is king for 11 years after Yoshiel. He dies in battle. He's going to rebel against the Babylonians. It's going to cost him his life. And then, and during his reign, Allah Nebuchadnezzar Melech Bavel. Melech Bavel came and took over Yehoiakim, and he sent him to Bavel also, goes into exile. The exile, many of the Kelim of the Beit HaMikdash, the temple's not destroyed, we'll see why. And how bad Yehoiakim was, again, in the rest of the books. And then Yehoiakim's king for 3 months, and he goes into exile. And then Tzidkiyahu is king for 11 years. And then the temple was destroyed in year 11 of Tzidkiyahu. Okay, that's the background. In light of that, we can read the first line of Yirmiyahu. Where are we? Yirmiyahu, Jeremiah. Okay. This is the time period of Yirmiyahu. Okay. When during the reign of Yoshiel, from the 13th year of his reign, that's when his tshuva movement began. And then during the reign of Yehoiakim for 11 years, until the 11th year of Tzidkiyahu, right, until Jerusalem was sent into exile and the temple was destroyed in the month of Av. And then you have his Hakdashah when he becomes a Navi. Okay. Now, why do we do all that? What I want to claim is, when Yirmiyahu becomes king, when Yirmiyahu starts his career, it's at the beginning of Yoshiel's reform. What's happening in the country? We'll get to the religious side in a minute. What's happening politically? I'd like to call this, if you remember the Wizard of Oz, I call it Ding Dong, the Witch is Dead. Meaning, for the last 100 years, Ashur has been running the Middle East. Remember, it was even before Tiglat-Pileser. We had Tiglat-Pileser, and then we had Sargon, then we had Sancheriv. Israel, we were, at the time of Uziel, that's when Isaiah's career began. Things were great. Remember, we had a united kingdom. Things were awesome. Let me take a look at I'll share what we did last time. When he became king, during this time period, where are we? Annotate and marker up here. Okay. During this time period, things were great. Ashur was not yet a superpower. Aram had fallen. Israel's the United Kingdom, and this is when Yeshayahu began his career. Yeshayahu began his career. We talked about, and then Yoshiel warns them: fix your ways, fix your society. They don't listen, and then God brings Ashur to punish them. That's why Ashur Shevet Api. And even though he's not so bad, Yoash is punished already. The worst, he starts getting really bad time of Achaz. Achaz is angry with God. And God's angry with Achaz. We have the topic when you study Isaiah. Chizkiel, when he becomes king, does tshuva. And there's a small recovery, with Jerusalem being saved, but a very minor one. Things in Menachem get even worse. We go into exile. And then we have the return during the reign of Yoshiel. Now, and then we have the Korban, Galut Yoachin and Galut Tzidkiyahu. That's my little table there. Yirmiyahu and Yechezkel are the prophets of this time period. Now, my claim is as follows. This line here, let me make it nice and thick. Let me make it thick. Let's start here. I want a thicker line. Here we go. This line here, I want to call Korban Beit Rishon. Why? If I look at the empire with the United Kingdom and the great years of Beit Rishon, it all ends with the Assyrian conquest. It's over. And this is about 100 years, close to 100 years of Jewish history. And in the eyes of the people, Ashur was our arch enemy. Ashur finally fell apart. Her father crumbled, and there's a vacuum in the Middle East, and it's up for grabs between Bavel, who's going to end up taking over, but Egypt is also in on the as a possibility. And there's a big fight over who's going to control the Middle East. Will it be Bavel? Will it be Egypt? Will Ashur recover? The big battles in Karkemish, which I think is 606 BCE or 609 or 606 around there, which is would be like the 4th year of Jehoiakim. We'll see. I mean, I'm sorry, the last year of Yoshio. I think it's 609, maybe 612. But you'll get the exact. We'll get next week. We'll get the exact years. Yoshio becomes king exactly in this vacuum, right over here. See that things getting better? What's the reason? What's the political reason for Yoshio's rise to power? And archaeology matches this perfectly. There's tremendous growth during the reign of Yoshio. There's a vacuum in the Middle East. The old superpower is gone. And because of that, we'll see this later in Yirmiyahu, many of the exiles are able to return. Not all of them, but at least a small group of them are able to return from Assyrian exile. Remember, the Assyrians exiled many of the northern tribes. Many people in Judah also went away. Now that Ashur is falling apart, many of the exiles can return. The Judean kingdom is able to take over the north again, and our borders are expanding all the way to the Galilee, to the Shomron and to the Galilee, and down to the south. Yoshio builds, almost becomes a superpower again. Not like Uziel, but on the way there. In the eyes of the people, the Gzar Din is over. Got that? And I call it Reshit Tzmichat Geulatenu. I hope you understand my analogy. Right? The overall feeling of the people is the worst is over, Bayit Rishon's gone, and all the prophecies of Isaiah, whether at least Isaiah chapter 11 and 12, if not the Deuter Isaiah, which is what Yoel Benun's word is that the people feel they're being fulfilled in their time period. Now, when you have this feeling of this is redemption, and you can't go wrong anymore, it leads people to making a bit maybe too much self-confidence. And I'm going to use that to explain what's happening, what's Yirmiyahu's key message, and what's happening during his time period, and why the people don't listen to him. Yoshio was this great king, and what happens? Despite his greatness and all his tshuva he did, he goes to war to stop the Egyptian army from marching through the land on the way to the battle of Karkemish. Egypt is not on its way to conquer Israel. Egypt has nothing to do with it. So King of Egypt is going to say, "Leave me alone. I have nothing to do with you. I'm not fighting you. I'm on my way. Just let me pass through your country." Anyone remember what Chazal say? Why Yoshio attacked him? Why did Yoshio attack him? Attack the Egyptian army. Remember the pasuk he darshaned?
Lo yavor cherev ba'artzecha.
Yeah. He take the law from the Tochacha, from Bechukotai, Bechukotai Tishmaru, etc. It says, "I'll bless the land." V'cherev lo tavor ba'artzechem. Chapter 26 in Vayikra in the beginning. Now, what's that mean? Yoshio was sure that we're keeping God's laws properly. Bechukotai Tishmaru. And Sefer Menachem seems to support that. How could it be that such a frum king, who's doing so well, how can he lose a battle? Now, what leads him to go into battle? There's this confidence that this is redemption. And the worst is over. And sometimes when you're overconfident that you're in a redemptive process, you'll do things which are beyond your abilities. And that's what Chazal are going to say. The Navi told him, don't attack. But he says, "No, we can do it anyhow." Remember, there's a beautiful piyut we say on, or kina we say on Tisha B'Av, about how Yoshio, when he's dying, he says, "Tzadik Hashem ki piyu meriti." God was right, and I rebelled against him. When God told him, "Don't fight," he went anyhow. He didn't listen to the advice that he got. He went to fight anyhow. He was sure that he had other advisors. We'll talk about these advisors in a minute. Now, what Yirmiyahu is going to talk about, primarily, he'll be addressing most of the time a people praying to God in the temple, bringing sacrifices to God, claiming that they're God's people, and acting like God's people. But he's claiming that despite your prayers in the temple, etc., you're phony, he's going to call them, and your society is still corrupt. He's going to give a message very similar to Isaiah chapter 1, where the people are praying to God in the temple, what I call in good old consumer mode, but their society is corrupt. And they're wealthy, they're established, but they're not doing what's called tzedek u'mishpat. We'll see the best example will be in chapter 7. Let me take a quick look at it. I'll share the screen. Where are we? Jeremiah. I'll do it from here. Jeremiah chapter 7. We'll go over the time period in a second. But in chapter 7, what's he say? Here. Again, there's no timestamp on this one, but we'll try to figure out the time later on. Listen to what he talks about the people coming to Beit HaMikdash to pray. Stand in the entrance to the Beit HaMikdash and give the following message to the people. People coming to the Beit HaMikdash to pray to God. These are from people praying to God. You want to stay and dwell in this place? You want to stay in the land and not go into exile? Improve your behavior. Darchechem is what you're doing, Malachem is what you're planning on doing. Listen carefully. He's making fun of the words, we'll see, of the false prophets. We'll see what these false prophets are soon. The false prophets are telling the people, God's on your team. They're telling them this is redemption. All you need to do is pray, come to the temple and pray. God will be with you, and you can be more and more powerful. Okay? But they're not, these false prophets claim to be God's prophets. They're telling the people that God's on their side, telling them to pray to God and they can win all their wars and they continue to expand, but they're not telling them to improve their behavior. He says, no. Only if you fix your ways. Okay? If you do justice between your fellow man, then we get the classic Isaiah theme. Right? Don't oppress the widow and the orphan. Don't spill innocent blood. It means care about human life. Okay? And don't follow other gods as well. Then you can stay in this land. Then he gives examples of how bad they are. He throws the book at them for the second half of the Ten Commandments. You're breaking the second half of the Ten Commandments. We'll talk about what it means they're serving Baal. We'll talk about that soon, or probably next week we'll talk about that. And then you come with your behavior outside the temple is a disaster, especially between man and his fellow man. Then you come into Beit HaMikdash, associate with my name, and you're saying, I'm safe now, so I can continue to do all these terrible things. They're coming to the temple to cover up their guilt. Then he says, go take a tiyul to Shiloh, where my shkin was once there. Look what happened to Shiloh because of the bad behavior. So in a nutshell, we're see Yirmiyahu saying over and over again, he's talking to people who think they're praying to God, who think they're from, telling them, you're phony. Now, the people will say, I'm going to answer back, what do you mean? We're fine. And his colleagues, which he calls the false prophets, are telling him in God's name, God will be with them. But what's happening in Yirmiyahu's time period is that there's this feeling of Rashit Tzmichat Geulateinu, because the worst is over. This is our recovery. Nothing can go wrong again. And even though they've returned to God, their tshuva is more nationalistic than religious. That's my key point I want to get across. Right? There's a good reason for national tshuva. Why? Because we're finally free. We don't need Assyrian gods anymore because they're, what do you call it? Their empire fell. There's no other superpower. Now we can become a superpower. And we're growing leaps and bounds. And we're religious now. We're building our temple and we're claiming to be God's people. But you see from Yoshiahu's battle in Megiddo, it's very militant. The overall atmosphere is we can become a superpower. Our army's great again. We have these great building projects, and God will be with us, and nothing can go wrong again. And that leads him to too much focus on their strength and their growth, not enough on their religion, not enough on their society. And Yirmiyahu is going to give the same message that all the earlier Nevi'im gave. If you don't fix your society, all these sacrifices and all these prayers aren't going to help you. And over again, Yirmiyahu is going to go to the temple and tell the people at the temple, even though you claim to be religious, it's not enough. He's going to tell them your tshuva is not sufficient and fix your society again. And it's a message no one wants to listen to, no one cares about. They're sure he's wrong. They accuse him of being a false prophet. Now, so far he's no different than the other Navi. What's going to make this Navi special is going to be in the middle of Joachim's career. I'll get to that point in a minute. What's going to be the turning point in the book of Yirmiyahu, in the fourth year of Jehoiakim, halfway through his career. Remember, they have all these great years of Yoshiyahu where we're growing leaps and bounds, and everyone thinks they're fine, and he gives this nevuah that it's not enough. They don't listen to him. Joachim, when he becomes king, he's angry with God because Yoshiyahu's father was killed. He doesn't think it's fair. And let me explain why that's such a key event. If the only reason they're following God is because God is going good, I call them fair weather Jews. But as long as our country is growing leaps and bounds, we'll follow God. We'll come to his temple and pray. But if we lose a battle like we did in Megiddo, we get angry with God. We'll start going to other gods already. But Joachim's going to leave God. Not all the people are going to leave God. There'll be plenty of people coming to the temple still, but he'll be angry with God. And he'll sort of, well, some people follow other gods. Some people pointed failure on God. Other people are saying we have to serve God a little more. But no one's going to blame themselves for the defeat. And no one's going to say we have to fix society except for Yirmiyahu. Now, Yirmiyahu gives this message over and over again under Jehoiakim as well. No one listens again. And then finally, in the fourth year of Jehoiakim, again, as the Middle East is still up for grabs, Yirmiyahu gives a bombshell in the fourth year of Jehoiakim. And he says, in the name of God, because your tshuva was not enough, the Gzar Din of Menachem is still hanging over you. And if you don't do proper tshuva, it's still going. The temple will be destroyed, etc. You're going to exile unless you do proper tshuva. But in the meantime, there's one thing you can do to save your city and your country: put up a white flag to the Babylonians. Yirmiyahu is going to make a political prediction. He's going to say in the fourth year of Jehoiakim, which is soon after the Battle of Carchemish, which was again, Babel's not Israel yet, but they're up in Syria. He's going to make a prediction that the Babylonians are going to take over the entire Middle East. And that's why I call the whole series Yirmiyahu, Politics and Religion class. The first time a Navi is going to make a political prediction which will affect his whole career. God's going to tell Yirmiyahu to tell the people in the year 4 of Joachim, for the next 70 years, the Babylonians are running the Middle East. Not just Israel, the whole Middle East. God appointed them, the Babylonians, as his whip, as his executor. And he's going to allow the Babylonians to punish all the evil nations of the Middle East, including Israel. And there's nothing you can do about it. You can daven from today to tomorrow. You can do 20,000 prakim and tehillim, but Babel's running the show. The only way you can save your city and your temple is put up a white flag to the Babylonians. That's going to be Yirmiyahu's key message, starting in chapter 25. Now, you'll need to understand that. To understand other chapters, you'll need to understand that. But his main message, which, again, the book's way out of chronological order, which makes it confusing. But the key historical event is in year 4 of Joachim, where Yirmiyahu says, in the name of God, give in to the Babylonians. Now, no one wants to give in to the Babylonians because they think we can defeat the Babylonians. No one wants a new superpower. And the whole Middle East, other than Babel, all of our neighbors, especially Egypt, thinks that Babel can be defeated. Okay? Yirmiyahu goes and says, no, in the name of God, give in to Babel. Guess what's going to happen? Not all of his colleagues, most of his colleagues don't trust him, don't believe him. They claim he's being paid not by the European Union. They're being paid by the Babylonian forces. Now he's he's a mole. We're paying by them, and they accuse him of being a false prophet. And that's why they want to kill him. He has to go into hiding, and that explains half the book. Meaning, Yirmiyahu has to go into hiding because the political nature of his decree. He's telling the people, give in to the Babylonians, and that's what God wants you to do. The king and all the politicians and all the military people are saying, we can defeat the Babylonians. And this rabbi, who was very popular during the reign of Yoshiyahu, is going to run the army. Why? Because he's telling the people to turn sides. And if the soldiers hear his nevuot of telling people, give in to Babel, that's going to ruin the army effort, to the point the people are going to blame the Korban on Yirmiyahu for weakening the army. We could have defeated the Babylonians. This crazy left-wing rabbi destroyed the country. Just pardon the modern day analogy. Again, I'm just using modern day analogy to understand the tension going on. I'm not saying it's the same thing today. Some people might, but just for the sake of analogy, to imagine the parallels is shocking. But Yirmiyahu comes and says, in the name of God, give in to the Babylonians. And that's it. And that's what God wants you to do. Now, the politicians don't like hearing this. His colleagues don't like it either because they want the fight. They're telling the people, God can help you win the war. Just come to the temple and pray more. Yirmiyahu is saying that's not enough and that's not going to help. That's why they're going to accuse him of being a false prophet. That's why he has to go into hiding. They want to kill the guy. He goes on trial. He's saved at the last minute. His books are going to be burnt. We'll see. But the key issue that's going to make the book of Yirmiyahu exciting is understanding that Yirmiyahu is hated. And there's so many false prophets because they can't believe that God would say, give in to the Babylonians. And all his colleagues are saying, no, fight the Babylonians and pray harder and God will be with you. And Yirmiyahu is saying, you're causing the people to get killed. You're giving them a message that's going to cause their death. And whenever they ask him questions, God's on the other team, he's going to tell them. We'll see this over and over again through the book. Now, Yirmiyahu prays to God to punish the false prophets because they're misleading the people. There's going to be a great fight between Yirmiyahu and another false prophet, with Hanani ben Azur in the Beit HaMikdash. Yirmiyahu's going to go around with a yoke, saying, put yourself under the yoke of Bavel. And another prophet's going to take the yoke off his neck and break it, and saying, just like I broke the yoke, you're saying put yourself on the yoke of Bavel, I'm taking the yoke and breaking it, and God's going to break the yoke of Bavel. There's great arguments going on, but they're political in nature, and the question is, who do we align with, and do we go to war against Bavel, or do we accept them? And Yirmiyahu is telling the people, accept Babylonian sovereignty, give up on your sovereignty, accept autonomy under Bavel, but don't fight them, because God's not going to help you. And all the other prophets are saying, pray to God, and we can fight Bavel, and we'll survive. And that's why Yirmiyahu hates his life, hates his career. That's why people hate him. And that's going to be the background to the book. Now, real quick, I'll just share with you, because our time's up. I'll send this to the group later on. Here's the, where are we? We need this one. Yeah, we need here. Actually, I can give you this one. Okay, what are the key events in Yirmiyahu's career? So they begin from year 13 to year 31 is Yoshia's reign. So there's 18 years of reign during, Yirmiyahu's career is 18 years under Yoshia, 11 under Yokim, 11 under Tzidkiel, a total of 40 years. Now, year 13 of his reign is when the national tshuva begins. That was our source in Divrei Yamim, and it coincides with Ashur falling. They renovate the temple, and there's this great feeling of, I call Reshit Simichat Golatenu, the beginning of a redemption. Things are great again. And it's all ruined, right? I mean, Yoshio taking on the Egyptian army shows you how strong he was. And his tragic death in Megiddo, fighting Pharaoh Necho, is a trigger event that changes, the trajectory of where we're going. Yoakim takes over, supported by Pharaoh Necho, and therefore Yoakim, because he's put into power by Pharaoh Necho, who's angry with his father, with his brother who he deposed, has to align himself with Egypt, obviously, and Egypt is going to hopefully support us against fighting Bavel. Yoakim becomes king. He leaves God because he's angry. He of course, aligns himself with Egypt, and he's going to rebel against the Babylonian conquest. In year 4, Nebuchadnezzar becomes king of Bavel. That's the battle of when they win the battle of Carchemish, and they start controlling the whole Middle East. He starts marching on Israel, part of it, and takes over. But in year 8 of his reign, Yoakim rebels against Bavel. And after he's under his rule for 3 years, and he rebels against him in year 8. 3 years later, Nebuchadnezzar comes in, wipes out the city, takes over the city, but doesn't destroy the temple and doesn't exile everybody, only the aristocracy. That's exile is called Galut Yehoiachin. And basically, Yoakim puts up a white flag. Yoakim finally listens to Yirmiyahu, saves the city by putting up a white flag going to exile. Tzidkiel is appointed king by Bavel on the condition that the subservient. Tzidkiel is going to rebel against Bavel. He's going to plan to rebel in year 5. They'll rebel, and then the rebellion actually goes very good from years 5, 6, and 7. And then in year 9, Nebuzaradan, the general of Nebuchadnezzar, sent to put a siege on Jerusalem, and 11th year it's destroyed on Tisha B'Av, and that's the end of Beit Rishon. So that's and again, Yirmiyahu is doing his best. Yirmiyahu is not predicting the temple will be destroyed and everyone's going to go into exile. It ends up happening. His goal is to prevent the destruction of the temple. His 7 years that he talks about is 70 years of Babylonian rule, and that can't change. If they don't accept Babylonian rule, they're all gonna they'll be destroyed. I'll just give you one quick example of it in chapter 28. Is it here, I hope? Chapter 27 here. It says like this. If you put yourself in the yoke of Babel, you can stay in your land. If you fight them, and he says that. He gave a similar message to Yakim, but now he's giving this is later in the time of Tzidkiel. Put yourself in the yoke of Babel, serve him, and stay alive. Right? Why should you die, you and your people, the sword, etc.? Any nation who doesn't give in to Babel. Don't listen to the false prophets. Again, God's prophets saying things in God's name. These are God's prophets. These are prophets saying that they're representing God, giving people religious instruction and direction. They're telling the people, we can defeat Babel, just pray harder. Right? And they're making promises in God's name that God can help you defeat Babel if you come and pray. And Yirmiyahu says, don't listen to them, they're misleading you. And that's the core, that's going to be the key to understanding Yirmiyahu, why he doesn't like his job, why he wants to die, and why the people want to kill him, but why he has to give us a both anyhow. And then we'll talk about what we're supposed to do. That'll be later. So this is the background now. It's not going to help you too much in the early chapters of Yirmiyahu, because what's going to happen in the book, way out of time, in the book, here's the let me go back to this one here. There's a timeline. Yeah, here's the outline. Okay, the first chapters is what's called his Hakdasha, when he's given his job. But chapters 2 through 20, basically, there are lots of headers, but there's no timestamp. In other words, I'm telling you here that we have to talk about next week. We'll talk about the Megillat Sefer. But most likely chapters 2 to 6 are for the time of Yoshiyahu. Probably 7 to 10 is from Yoakim, and then there's miscellaneous units going back and forth from different time periods. But other than chapter 3, verse 6, which alludes to Yoshiyahu, there's no timestamp. In other words, there's no mention of who the king is and when the event happened. There's subunits, there's headers, we'll see. But there's a whole set of chapters which don't have dates. They sound very general, and we have to work very hard to figure out when they were given. Starting in chapter 21 through 29, everything has a date, and we're going back and forth from Tzidkiel back to Yoakim, back to Yoshia, back to Tzidkiel and Yoakim, back and forth like crazy. It's like really confusing. We'll try to explain why next week when we go through that. But there's another unit, which will be primarily the political message of giving into Babel. Okay, and I call this whole unit politically charged. There'll be prophecies of Nechama, and then there'll be the famous story we'll do next week. Chapter 36 is when he publishes his book and he gets burnt. And that'll be the background how the book of Yirmiyahu came about and why there's different sections in it. That'll be our topic for next week, which will explain the book. And the end of the book, then there'll be this a historical appendix, which the story how the temple was destroyed and the story of Gedaliah. That's like Sefer Melachim. It continues Sefer Melachim. And then there's the vote for the other nations in chapters 46 to 51 and a little epilogue at the end with the story of the Churban again. But that's the basic background of Yirmiyahu. For the next week, you'll be studying the first about 10, 15 chapters. But listen to his message, which is primarily about fixing society. He'll talk about idol worship, and he'll talk about justice and righteousness. And we have to figure out what idol worship is he talking about, because the people don't think they're serving idols. I'll just end with this. Yirmiyahu is going to tell the people, you think you're serving God? You're treating God like Baal. You're in the Beit HaMikdash, and he calls them idol worshippers. And they say, we're not idol worshippers. Why? I'll go back to my analogy of a consumer as opposed to employee. What's Avodat Baal? Baal is a rain god. Why do people pray to a rain god? Because they want rain. And why would Baal give them rain? If this Baal god, this rain god, hears people praising him, feeding him, etc., they'll give him rain. But anyone that serves Baal as a consumer who wants rain, if he didn't need rain, he wouldn't turn to Baal. It's not a deep belief in Baal or anything, special. It's convenient to God. Now, God says, I'm in charge of the rain, but I give you rain based on your behavior. We say every day in Shema. Yirmiyahu is saying, if you're coming to the temple and only praying to God for rain, you believe that God's in charge of rain, but you're not connecting between your understanding that God being in charge, but based on your deeds. You're just praying to God because you're in charge. You're praising God and praising Him and asking Him for everything you need, like a consumer, but it has no effect on your behavior. You're not internalizing the message that God's in charge, but He gives you based on your behavior, your reward. Then your entire relationship with God is like Baal. It's like, you call Him God. Yirmiyahu calls Him, that's Baal worship. You turn God into an idol. I call it idol worship, IDLE. I can see that, show you later in Yirmiyahu. That's why Yirmiyahu calls the people, you're idol worshippers. And the people say, no, what do you mean? We're not idol worshippers. We're serving God. If I want to take a modern day analogy, it's like some rabbis say people going to Uman and Har Meron, that's idol worship. Of course, the people going there aren't idol worshippers, they're from people. But other people say, they're attacking their understanding of God and their type of worship. I mean, it's probably a bad example, but it'll highlight what Yirmiyahu is going to talk about. So that'd be the background to understand Yirmiyahu. So again, next week I'll try to put it in order, but when you plow through the Prakim next week, just pay attention to how he talks about both idol worship and fixing society, and notice the blend between the two, but notice his rebuke of the people and try to figure out what he's angry at. Next week, when we see the chapters 21 through 29, and 36, that'll put the book together. And then later, we'll have to go back and see the earlier chapters. I'll check the chat real fast. Chat. Did Jeremiah tell the people about not fighting Bavel before he sent the letter? The road in Bavel? Oh no, that was after. No, it's staying in Bavel. That's later. That's 6 years later. That's chapter 29. In chapter 25 already, in the 4th year of Yehoiakim, he says Bavel's taking over. 6 years later, they go into exile, or 7 years later. Then he sends a letter to the people in Bavel, stay there and don't come back. Because the people in Bavel think they're coming back. Okay. And I do that in that series there. And that's it for the chat. Okay. Oh, here. Is it possible that Ammon's assassins didn't have such pure motives? I mean, there's always, most assassins think that they thought they had pure motives. But it seems like the assassins of Ammon were from, meaning because they're angry with. Remember, Menachem did tshuva at the end of his career, and Ammon goes back to the sins of Menachem. So why did the people assassinate him? I'm assuming they were doing it obviously for political reasons, but also probably at least they had religious excuses for doing it because he was serving other gods, and then they were executed by. I'm making too many assumptions, but I wouldn't be surprised if that was the background. When we did Sefer Melachim a little bit, I told you how Rechavam sin. I mean, Yeravam's sin part of it was making religious reform for political reasons. It's when the religion becomes a political tool, that's when things get really bad. Alrighty, okay. Have a good week, everybody, and hope this wasn't too depressing. Again, and any parallel to modern day events is only by coincidental. It's only to help understand, the situation they're in. I'm not saying it's the same thing nowadays. It's way more complicated. But
History rhymes.
yeah, it gives you something to think about, though. Alrighty. Okay, have a good week, everybody, and see you next week.